All right, so it's the beginning of the end for our class, unfortunately. We're switching now from looking at microeconomics to looking at macroeconomics. And when we do that, we are going to be considering a different type of questions. All right, so from the microeconomic side, we were looking at individual decisions, individual firms, right? Government policies and how they affect individuals. Now we're going to be looking at the economy as a whole. So, what should we would generally think in terms of the federal government do as a national policy? We're thinking more about those type of questions. Like how do we affect the economy as a whole? So, in generally, we've got a self-regulating economy where the interactions between consumers and producers find some balance. All right, and when we have a permanent shock, there's going to be this idea that the government can intervene to help us out. So Keynesian economics says failures and government interventions to counteract the business cycle when we have downturns. So we've seen this recently with the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Once it spread out, the businesses and everything had to shut down for a while to try and minimize the impact of the virus. And when that happened, we entered a recession. We had a shock to our economy. A lot of people became unemployed. The government had to take some measures to increase spending to counter that effect. So they gave out a $1,200 stipend, right, to everyone, and they also increased unemployment benefits temporarily. They pumped more money into the economy to try and counteract the effect, the negative impact of COVID-19 and shutting down those businesses. So there's two levers that the government has to impact or influence the economy. And one of them is monetary policy. That's controlled by the Federal Reserve. So this is where the government decides how much money to supply. Okay, and this money they supply affects interest rates, so the cost of borrowing money. All right, and if they keep it lower, that's going to have a stimulating effect. If they raise it, it's going to they'll generally do that during times of expansion. It'll have the opposite. Fiscal policy is where the government spends money, right, and that has wide impacts on our economy. So the Federal Reserve will set, think of this as the country's national bank. They will set interest targets, all right, and those interest targets will influence how investors borrow money or don't borrow money. So if we keep the interest rate low, there's a higher incentive to borrow money because it's relatively cheap to borrow money. Whereas if the interest rate is higher, there's less incentive to borrow money because it's relatively expensive. Okay. This knowledge check is going to be your practice, so we can skip that for now. All right. Now we've got the business cycle to consider. So over the span of many years, we're going to alternate between periods of growth and periods of decline. So periods of decline are known as recessions, and that's where our output is going to decrease. We'll see higher unemployment, reduced spending, firms are going to fail, all right? So like I said, COVID-19 kind of created one of those. Then we'll have times of expansion, which is where our economic output increases. We'll have larger number of firms, decreased unemployment, increased spending. So a peak is where we go from expansion to recession. We go from increasing our output to decreasing, whereas a trough is the opposite. Looking at our graph here, we've got recessions where our unemployment will increase. So those are in the early 1990s, the early 2000s, and from 2008 to 2009. You'll notice the unemployment graph has increases. Expansions are going to be those years where we're in decline. So you'll notice those are longer. That would be like from 1992 to 2000, we were decreasing. right? And where we switch from unemployment increasing to decreasing, from a recession to an expansion, we've got a trough. And where we switch from an expansion to a recession, we've got a peak. So long run, our economy is going to bend towards the positive as technology improves, right? All of these factors, we get more efficient. We're going to create more, so our economic output increases. We're going to have this idea of standard of living, right, which is your quality of life or your ability to pay for your basics. So GDPs are economy's output as a whole, and we're going to look at GDP per capita, which means GDP per person. This is just a trend graph of our GDP per person. So you'll notice from 1900 through to current, our GDP per person has become more than 5 times as large, which is quite a change, right? Showing our economic output just keeps increasing. Got another knowledge check, which will be your practice. All right, deflation is going to be where the price of goods and services falls. Your money is worth relatively more. So this is fairly rare, but your purchasing power increases when the prices fall. Inflation, which is much more common and something we're more familiar with, is where the price of goods raise and your money becomes worth less relatively than it was. So short run, when we have little access to jobs or high unemployment, that'll normally be accompanied by deflation, and inflation is more of a long run thing, and that'll be determined by the money supply. We've got this generalization that with recessions we'll have deflation, expansions will have inflation. All right, so price stability. This is going to be looking at trying to limit inflation and deflation. All right, and that's because wages are sticky. So wages don't go up and down with changes in the market, right? They take a longer time to increase or decrease. So government policy should aim to keep prices stable. All right, and sometimes, especially in developing countries, that government policy fails, and we end up in a situation with hyperinflation, where the government is basically just printing larger and larger bills, and they're increasing the money supply so dramatically that the money that you have becomes virtually worthless, and prices skyrocket. Got another practice spot. All right. So a trade deficit is going to be when a country imports more than it exports, and a trade surplus is going to be when we export more than we import. All right. So each of these spots on the graph has a different implication. All right. The U.S. would be at a trade deficit here. Germany, China, and Saudi Arabia all at surpluses because they're exporting more than they're importing.